haboim. Welcome everyone. We're about to begin Be'ezras Hashem together on Daf Vov Amud Aleph at the very top, the new Mishnah. The Mishnah discusses when a person amasses, he collects his Machzis HaShekel. What is included in a Machzis HaShekel if he goes beyond the amount that is indeed worth Machzis HaShekel? Says the Mishnah, Hamechanes Mos V'Omar. Somebody who gathers together and he collects money a little bit at a time. Hare V'Omar, he says, Hare Eilu L'Shikli. Behold, this will be towards my Machzis HaShekel. Beis Shammai Yomrim Moisoron Nidava. Beis Shammai says when he has additional money beyond that Machzis HaShekel, then it's going to be towards a Nidava, meaning it's going to be for the communal oilos. There's something called the parts of the Mizbeach that when they're not being used for other korbanos, so there's a fund that provides oilos korbanos for the Mizbeach. So he says that will go towards that. Beis Hillel argues and he says the extra amount is chulin. Why? Because it's a hekdesh betos, and therefore hekdesh betos einoi hekdesh, says Beis Hillel. The next case in the Mishnah, Sha'avi mehen shikli, he says that I will bring from them my shekel. Shavin shamoisar chulin. Here, even Beis Shammai agrees with Beis Hillel that the extra amount will go to chulin. Because after all, he says, Sha'avi, I will bring from them. That means that he's saying that I'll bring from these coins, the Machzis shekel. When I get beyond that, then he understands, he's clarifying from the beginning that's going to be going towards chulin. The Mishnah continues, Eilu l'chatosi. If they say, when he's collecting, amassing amounts for a korban chatos, and he says that these are for my korban chatos, then shavin shamoisar nidava. Here, even Beis Hillel agrees with Beis Shammai that the extra amount goes towards a nidava. The Gemara explained the reasoning. The next case, sha'avi mehen chatosi, I will bring from them, from these monies that I'm giving, my korban chatos. Shavin shehamoisar chulin. Here, everybody agrees, as we said above, including Beis Shammai, that it will go to chulin any extra amount. Now the Gemara explains, why does Beis Hillel make a distinction between when it comes to the shekel, the Machzis HaShekel, and the korban chatos? He said when it comes to Machzis HaShekel, and he says Hare Eilu L'Shikli, and there's extra, then he says that goes to chulin. Yet when he says Eilu L'Chatosi, if there's extra, it goes to Nidava. So Gemara explains, Omar Rabbi Shimon, Ma bein shkolim lechatos. What is the difference between the two? Elo shel shkolim yesh lohen kitzva, ulechatos ein lo kitzva. The difference is that shkolim, there's a machzis hashekel, it's defined as a half a shekel, whereas the chatos is not defined. It could be something that is less money or even more than that, and therefore there's a distinction. In other words, when it comes to somebody saying Hare Eilu L'Shikli, he gets to his half a shekel. Beis Hillel says anytime over that will be chulin. But when it comes to saying Eilu L'Chatosi, since there's no fixed amount, so whatever extra will go towards then kedusha of the nidava. Rabbi Yehuda takes issue with Rabbi Shimon's distinction, and he says, Af l'shkolim ein lohen kitzvah. Even when it comes to shekel, the Machzis HaShekel, there isn't also a kitzvah, a fixed amount. And he explains, Keshe'olu Yisrael min hagoylo, when Klal Yisrael went into the exile, they went into the diaspora, hoyu shoiklin darkoinos. They used the currency called darkoinos. Chazru lishkol sloim. Then they went and they used the currency of sloim. Chazu lishkol tivoim. Then further, later on, they used the currency of tivoim. Here, all of these lashonos, when it says shoiklin, darkonos, and chazu lishkol sloim, and chazu lishkol tavoim, here it's talking about the lishkol over here. It doesn't mean the Machzis HaShekel, but rather lishkol over here means that they used the currency at the time. When it came to commerce, they used the shekel of they use the darkonos rather, or the sloim, or the tavoim. Bikshu lishkol on that Tvoim, they wanted to then take, how Lishko goes back to the original understanding of making Machzis HaShekel, from that half of coin of the Tvoim, and therefore they would give a dinarim, v'lo kiblu mehen, but the Chachamim did not accept that. That was lower than the amount of the Machzis HaShekel from the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. So therefore, Rabbi Yehuda argues, we see even by when it comes to the Machzis HaShekel, it's not kitzbah. Rabbi Shimon says, but Afa Pikein Yad Kulan Shave. When it's going to be accepted in one locale, whatever time period that is, what they're going to use for the currency, then that would be Machzis HaShekel. They'll use half a shekel from that. And therefore, it would be considered to be kitzbah. Aval Chatos, but when it comes to a korban Chatos, there's no amount at all, says Rabbi Shimon. There's no fixed amount whatsoever. Zeh mevi besela, v'zeh mevi b'shtayim, v'zeh mevi b'sholo. Some will buy it for 1 sela, some for 2 or for 3. Ask the Gemara hamechanes v'chulei. The Gemara is talking about what the Mishnah says: one who amasses, one who gathers together, and he saves up enough to her Machzis HaShekel. So we said, when he says Harei Elu Lishikli, there's a machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai says the extra amount will go towards Nedava, it has Kedusha. Beis Hillel says that no, the extra amount will be Chulin because it's a Hekdesh Betos and it's Eino Hekdesh. The Gemara now says, Rabbi Yosi B'Shem Rabbi Lozar, Ma Pligin, what is their machlokes? Where are they arguing? The Gemara explains, B'michanes Prutroit. Prutroit means that they're talking about where somebody only has a little amount of money, and slowly he then saves up till he gets to the amount that he needs for Machzis HaShekel. Then there's a machlokes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Aval b'oimer elishikli. Kol ama modai shal masor nedava. But if he then takes a large amount at one time, even beyond a half a shekel, and on that he says elu lishikli, everybody would agree that would then have any extra amount would go toward a nedava. The assumption over here is because he knows that there's more than a half a shekel worth in his hands, and therefore when he holds on to all of this money and he says these words elu lishikli, he clearly has intention that the additional amount, the moisar, is going to be given to a nedava. Whereas Rabbi Chia, Rabbi Biva, B'Shem Lozar, he takes the opposite view. He says, Ma Pligin, what is the argument between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai? Their argument is B'mechanes Proitroit. As we said before, when somebody's coming to gather, he's coming to collect and save up a small amount at a time for his Machzis HaShekel. Then there's a machlokes, if there's moisar, there's extra, does that go to Nedava like Beis Shammai says, or goes for Chulin like Beis Hillel holds? Aval ba'oimer el lishikli, but if he says el lishikli, that means he's holding on to a large amount of money, and he says el lishikli, kuli amamoidoi sha'moisoron is the Chulin. Everybody would agree that it goes to Chulin, including Beis Shammai. So here we have two different understandings. We have a machlokes. We have that which Rabbi Yosi in the name of Rabbi Lozar says that everyone would agree that it's going to Nedava. And then we have the Ravivi in the name of Rabbi Lozar that's saying that everyone agrees that it goes to Chulin. Or Rabbi Chia says, Masnisa Messiah Rabbi Vivi. Our Mishnah support the latter opinion that says, like Rabbi Vivi in the name of Rabbi Lozar, that when you have extra, everybody would agree that goes to Chulin, including Beis Shammai. This not, because it says in the Mishnah, Omer Rabbi Shimon, Ma ben shkolim lechatas. What is the difference between shkolim and lechatas? Here the Gemara understands, not like we explained in the Mishnah, but rather the Gemara understands now that Rabbi Shimon is coming to explain in general the difference between shkolim and chatas, not to explain how we explained in the Mishnah why Beis Hillel changes his tune, but rather what is the reason between shkolim and chatos in general. And therefore he explains elisha shkolim yesh lan kitzva ulechatos ein lahen kitzva. And if that's indeed the case, the difference is that shkolim has kitzva and the chatos does not have kitzva. So then ma anon kaimin, what are we then dealing with over here that Rabbi Shimon is talking about? Im ba'oimer sha'avi mehen shikli. If we're talking about a case where he says I will bring from here the shekel, the machzis shekel, then kula alma moidoi, sheha moisar and chulin. Mishnah says everybody agrees that in that case any additional amount would be chulin, including Beis Shammai. Everybody agrees. If he says, I will bring from this money my korban chatos, again, everybody agrees that the additional amount will go towards chulin also. Beis Shammai would agree with that. So what was Rabbi Shimon referring to when he says this distinction between shkalim and chatos? Shkalim is with a kitzvah and chatos without a kitzvah. Allah says the Gemara must be kain anu kaimin. It's this that we're dealing with when Rabbi Shimon says this. Bo'omer eilu l'shikli shkalim ayidei kitzvason min haTorah moisaron chulin. When he says eilu l'shikli, then the shkalim that is fixed from the Torah, then the additional amount would be chulin. Chatos, she'ein kitzvason min haTorah, moisar nedava. Whereas chatos, which does not have a fixed amount, does not have kitzvah, that additional amount would go nedava, and that's what Rabbi Shimon was referring to. So we see over here that indeed a kasha on the way Rabbi Yossi explained in the name of Rabbi Lazar. Gemara says, "Mo ovad lo Rabbi Yossi b'shem Rabbi Lazar." What would Rabbi Yossi then defend himself when he said the name of Rabbi Lazar? That indeed the case where he took a lot of money at the same time, the extra would be nedava. How would he explain that if Rabbi Shimon is making his distinction between shkalim and chatos? Posar law, he would say that Rabbi Shimon is not talking about a case in general where you have a lot of money holding in your hand. Rather, he's not talking about that case. Rather, he's talking about pasal b'michanes b'proitroit ukebeis hillel. He's explaining the way we explained it in the Mishnah, that Rabbi Shimon is coming to distinction. Why does Beis Hillel change his tune when it comes to the case of shkalim? There he said, when a person says harei eilu l'shikli and there's extra, Beis Hillel says that it goes towards chulin. Yet when it comes to chatos, and he says eilu l'chatosi, then he says it goes towards truma, to the nedava. On that, Rabbi Shimon is coming to explain, because shkalim is kitzvah, and when it comes to chatos, it's not kitzvah. I asked the Gemara v'hatanina, but it says in the Mishnah lekamon on Amud Beis moisa shkalim chulin. There it says that when he's holding on to a lot of coins, that extra will go out to chulin. L'chara, even Beis Shammai then agrees that the extra goes to chulin. Kasha again on Rabbi Yossi, name of Elazar. Answers the Gemara, Passer law, he would answer b'mechanes b'proitroit ukebeis hillel. The same answer we said. It's talking about that he then was saving up a little at a time. And like Beis Hillel said, the distinction between shkalim and chatos, that shkalim, when there's extra, ultimately will go towards chulin. The Gemara now goes after the parentheses and says the following: Hamafrish shikloi, one who separates his machzis hashekel, v'sover shehu chayiv, v'nimtza she'eno chayiv. He thinks that he's chayiv, and he made a mistake, and indeed he was not chayiv a machzis hashekel. He had already given it before, so the din is lo kodash. It doesn't have sanctification. Hamafrish shnayim v'sover shehu chayiv shnayim. He was mafrish too, and he then realized that he's not chayiv too. Only one. That second one, what is the din with that? In other words, the Gemara has a question, because when it came to one, when he was never even chayiv, and he took out one, or he took out two, it wasn't chal. But when he was really chayiv one, and he took out two, maybe the second one has a din of kedusha. What is the din? Ma'avilei. The Gemara says, Nishmoin min hado. That means like Toshma. Let's bring the following proof. It states the following: Hafrish chatosoi, one who separates his korban chatos, v'sover shehu chayiv v'nimtza she'eno chayiv, and he thinks that he is chayiv a korban chatos, and indeed he's not chayiv. It says over here, loy kodsha. It wasn't sanctified. Here it says a similar din. parallel to the one that we said before, that when it comes to being mafrish, the korban chatos, so he's mafrish 2, thinking that he was chayiv 2 and he was only chayiv 1. What's the din? What do you do with the extra 1 that he was mafrish? Says the Gemara, Elaroya. Rather, he lets it graze until it gets a mum, then he sells it for the value, and then gives that for a nedava. Hachanami eil nedava. So too over here, we'll say the same thing. When he then separated 2 shkolim, 2 machzis hashekel, he was only chayev 1. The extra 1 then should be going towards a nedava. On that, the Gemara asks, how can you say that? That's not. Don't we have the Mishnah saying otherwise? V'choheich oimer ato elu. How can you say these things? Hare, in our Mishnah, we said that if you have an addition amount, right? We said that there's a difference between shkolim and chatos. Shkolim, Beis Hillel says, when you have an extra, it goes towards the chulin. And chatos is different. Chatos, since it doesn't have kitzvah the way Rabbi Shimon explains, there the din is that it's nedava. So you can't bring me a raya from chatos to shkolim. The Mishnah brought Rabbi Yehuda, who was choylek. He didn't like the Rabbi Shimon's svara to mechalek between chatos and shkolim using kitzvah and no kitzvah. The Gemara says, Dar koinos, explaining the coins, the way Rabbi Yehuda said, he proved it by saying that there's no such kitzvah even by shkolim, because we see in history that first they had the shkolim. That means that they used the in the goyla the dar koinos for their currency. Then they used the sloim, and then they used the tvoim. So we see that they don't have kitzvah either. They also used different currencies, which using half a shekel from that, half the amount from that. Gemara now says, explaining, identifying these coins. Rabbi dar koinos are dinarim. Dar koinos are dinarim, which really is two sela. Chazu lishkol sloim kishmuan. Then they went and they used the currency of sloim, as the name sounds, as the name implies. Sloim, they use sela. Chazu lishkol tevoin. Then they went and they used the currency of tevoin, which is palge sloim, which is half of sloim. Bikshu lishkol dinarim. They wanted to then use dinarim, and then half of that would be kartin, which would be a quarter of a sela. But the Chacham did not accept that because it went down lower than the amount of a half a shekel. So when it's more, then it was accepted. But if it's less than a half a shekel, not. What's the proof from that? What's the source? The Gemara brings min hada from this, from here. The pasuk is on the pasuk. Ve'emadnu aleinu mitzvos. We took upon ourselves the mitzvos. Lose shlishis hashekel b'shana, to give a third of a shekel for the year, referring to not the shekel but the currency. La'avodas beis Elokeinu, for the service of beis Elokeinu. So over here it says that there's a minimum amount of going to be shlishis of the shekel, not the shekel itself of the coin, but rather the currency that we're talking about, and therefore it cannot be less than a half a shekel worth. And whereby, if we said a krorton, that would have been less, that would have been a quarter of a sela, and that would not be valid. Rav Chilkiah b'shem Rabbi Acha, now the darshan, the pasuk that we had just brought, and says mikan, from this pasuk that states mitzvahs loses shlishis hashekel b'shana. Mikan, from here said tzorich adam l'shalish shikloi gimel pa'amim b'shana. From here we learn out that a person has to then give 3 different times a year a shekel for tzedakah. Mikan she'ein matrichin al tzibur yosem gimel pa'amim b'shana. And therefore from here we learn out that we cannot toveya from the tzibur more than 3 times of the year, because since they have an obligation to give tzedakah 3 times a year, 3 different shekel a year, we can't then obligate them more than that during the year. Rabbi Avin explains a different drush from this pasuk. Mikan legimos soin, mikan lesholosh kupos, mikan legimo hafroshois. Since when it comes to the trumas halishka, from here we learn out there are 3 times of the year that they're mafrish from 3 kupos. Each kupa has also 3 sloim, 3 soin. That's the amount. So we make a different hafrosha 3 times a year from this lishka. See, that the Gemara brings from the pasuk itself, teaching me Masechet Shekalim, the following drashos. It says, I'll read the entire pasuk. Ze yitnu kol ha'over ala pekudim Masechet HaShekel. This they will give those who pass the census. Will then give a half a shekel b'shekel hakodesh, with the holy shekel esrim geira hashekel. 20 geira is the shekel. Machzis hashekel truma Hashem will be a truma for Hashem. So they darshan the following. This they will give those who pass the census. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Nechemya, Chad Amar Lefish Shechatu b'Machzis Hayoim Yitnu Machzis HaShekel. One learned, since they were chayte in the Chet HaEgel, which was half of the day. It says Boishesh. That means to say that that Moshe Rabbeinu came late. Chazal darshan from the word Sheish. It was 6 hours into the day, namely in the middle of the day. B'Chatzois Machzis Hayoim. So he says because they were chayte from Machzis Hayoim, half of the day. Therefore, they must give Yitnu Machzis HaShekel. V'chad amar lefi shechatu b'sheishos b'yoim Yitnu Machzis HaShekel do'ovad shita garmesin. Since they were over, they were choyte in the Chet HaEgel again in half the day after sheishos. Therefore, they have to then compensate by getting a kapora, by giving half a shekel, which is the value of shita garmesin, which is 6 garmesin, the currency that was used in times of Moshe Rabbeinu. Rabbi Yeshua ben Bar Nechemya b'Shem Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, he learns a different drasha. Lefisha avu al aseres hadibrois. When they were chayte with the Chet HaEgel, which was a chet in Avodah Zarah, that's shekel connected the entire aseres hadibrois. Therefore, yeh noisin kol echad vechad asara geira. Therefore, each one has to give 10 geira, and that ends up being a half a shekel, as the pasuk says, esrin geiros. Therefore, half of that is 10 geira. Rabbi Berechia, Rabbi Levi b'Shem Rabbi Shimon Lakish, they say the following: Lefisha machru bechara shel Rachel be'esrim kesef. Since they sold the bechor of Rachel, referring to Yosef HaTzadik, for 20 kesef. Therefore, they must, each person who is poide his firstborn son, have to give esrim kesef. Now, when it comes to esrim kesef, it's really 20 dinar, and 4 dinar is equal to 1 selah, and one is poide, and therefore comes out to be 5 selah that they sold Yosef HaTzadik. So to be poide one's bechor, his son, it has to be given 5 selah to the kohen. Rabbi Pinchas b'Shem Rabbi Levi lefisha machru bechara shel Rachel be'esrim kesef. Since they sold Yosef HaTzadik, the bechor of Rachel, for 20 kesef. Again, 20 kesef is 20 dinar. V'nofel lekol echad ve'echad mehem tabo. And each one then received, each of the 10 brothers, because Binyamin was not included, received a coin of a tabo, which is the value of 2 dinar. Therefore, each one has to give a value of a tabo for his machzis hashekel.